The call came in at 4:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, right as I was standing in the checkout line at the pharmacy with a basket full of things I didn't really need, just things that felt good to hold. My card was declined, then declined again. The cashier, a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that said Priya, tried it a third time out of politeness more than hope, and I watched her face do that soft, apologetic thing that people do when they're about to deliver bad news to someone who clearly isn't used to hearing it. I told her it must be a mistake, some kind of bank error, and I stepped out of line red-faced while a man behind me sighed loud enough for the whole store to hear. I left my basket on the little shelf by the register, the one where abandoned items go to die, and I walked out into the parking lot to call the bank, already rehearsing my irritation. The woman on the phone was polite in that scripted, careful way that customer service people are trained to be when they know they're about to say something that will upset you. She told me the primary account holder had submitted a request that morning to remove me as an authorized user on 3 separate cards. I asked her to repeat herself because I genuinely thought I had misheard. She repeated herself. I asked who the primary account holder was, already knowing the answer somewhere in the pit of my stomach before she said it. My son, Daniel. My only child, 31 years old, sitting in an office 40 minutes away, had spent his lunch break removing his mother from the credit cards that had, admittedly, been in his name for the last 6 years, ever since my divorce left my own credit in ruins, and he generously, or so I had believed at the time, added me as a user so I could rebuild. I want to be honest with you about who I was before that Tuesday, because this isn't a story about a helpless woman who got lucky. My name is Carol Whitfield. I am 58 years old, and for 22 years I ran the back office of a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio, the kind of job where nobody notices you until something goes wrong, and then suddenly everybody wants to know how you fixed it so fast. I handled payroll, vendor contracts, insurance claims, and eventually, after our CFO retired, most of the financial oversight for a company that did just under $30 million a year in revenue. I know how money moves. I know how it hides. I know how people convince themselves they deserve things that were never theirs to take. I mention this now early because it matters for what comes later, and because I think you deserve to know that the woman standing in that parking lot, humiliated and furious, was not someone without resources. She was someone who had, for the first time in a long while, forgotten to use them on her own behalf. I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I didn't cry, not yet. I did the thing I always do when I'm hurt, which is start making a list in my head. A habit 30 years in finance will burn into a person permanently. I listed the cards. I listed the balances I knew about. I listed the last time Daniel and I had spoken, which was 9 days earlier, a short, strange phone call where he'd asked, almost too casually, how much I usually put on the joint card each month. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Mothers don't often suspect their sons of laying groundwork. To understand how we got to that parking lot, you have to go back 3 years, to the spring my husband of 31 years, Richard, left me for a woman he'd met at a conference in Tampa, a woman 11 years younger than our son. The divorce was ugly in the quiet, bureaucratic way divorces are ugly when both people are too proud to scream in front of lawyers. Richard had handled our finances for most of our marriage. Old-fashioned, I know, but it was the arrangement we'd fallen into in 1994 and never questioned. And when the dust settled, I discovered he'd been the one whose name was on almost everything. The house technically was his. The joint accounts drained faster than they should have. My credit score, which I hadn't checked in a decade, because why would I, had collapsed under debts I hadn't known existed, co-signed things from years earlier that had gone unpaid during the chaos of the split. Daniel stepped in during that period, and I want to be fair to him, because for a while he was genuinely good to me. He helped me find an apartment. He sat with me at the kitchen table with a legal pad, working out a budget. He added me to his credit card so I could start building a payment history again, and for the first year I used them carefully, paid my portion religiously, transferred him money the same day the statement closed. He told me not to worry about it. Family helps family, and I believed him, because I had raised him to believe that too. The trouble, if I'm honest with myself now, started small enough that I explained it away for a long time. Daniel began asking to borrow against the emergency fund I still had, the one modest cushion I'd managed to preserve from the divorce settlement. A little under $60,000 sitting in a money market account that I had told him about only because I was proud of having protected it. He needed $6,000 for a car repair, then $8,000 for what he called a business opportunity, something to do with a friend's startup, then $11,000 framed as a short-term bridge loan while he waited on a bonus at work that he swore was coming. Each time he paid a little back, just enough to keep the story alive, and each time the amount he asked for next was larger than the last. I told myself he was my son, that this was what mothers did, that I had more than I needed and he had less than he wanted, and somewhere in there, I stopped being careful the way I would have been careful with anyone else in the world. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until months after the parking lot, was that Daniel had also been telling a very different story to the woman he'd started seeing 8 months earlier, a woman named Kayla who worked in marketing and drove a car nicer than anything either of us owned. He'd told her that his mother was, in his words, sitting on money and being difficult about sharing it. that I was controlling and guilt-tripped him whenever he asked for help, that removing me from the cards was less about credit management and more about, as he apparently put it to her, finally taking control of his own financial life. I only learned this later because Kayla, to her credit, turned out to have a conscience that outlasted the relationship. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and a story like this deserves to be told in the order it actually happened. The night of the parking lot call, I drove home and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Daniel and I had once made that careful budget together, and I did not call him. This surprised me as much as anyone. My instinct, historically, had always been to smooth things over immediately, to call and ask what happened and give him every opportunity to explain, because that's what a good mother does. That's what I told myself a good mother does. But something in me that Tuesday night simply refused to move. I think it was the accumulation of 100 small dismissals finally reaching a weight I couldn't carry politely anymore. So instead of calling, I opened my laptop and I did what 22 years in finance had trained into my bones. I made a spreadsheet. I want to walk you through what that spreadsheet eventually contained, because it becomes important later, and because I think there's something satisfying in watching a quiet, careful woman turn her hurt into documentation instead of drama. I listed every transfer I had made to Daniel over the previous 3 years, cross-referenced against my own bank statements, which I still had full access to regardless of what had happened to the credit cards. The number, once I added it all up with actual attention instead of the vague, forgiving math I'd been doing in my head, came to just over $94,000. Not all of it was loans he'd asked for outright. Some of it was covering his half of the credit card statements when he claimed to be short that month. Some of it was a temporary arrangement where I'd started paying his auto insurance directly because his card had been declined once, back before I understood that pattern for what it was. $94,000. I sat with that number for a long time. It was more than a third of what I had left in the world after the divorce, given not out of foolishness exactly, but out of a love that had been systematically taken advantage of by someone who knew precisely how to ask. I still didn't call him that night. Instead, I called my sister, Denise, who lives 2 hours south and has never in her life minced words with me. I told her everything, the cards, the number, the parking lot, and there was a long silence on the other end before she said quietly, "You know he's been doing this to you for years, right?" I just didn't think it was my place to say it. That stunk more than the decline at the pharmacy had, honestly, because it meant other people had seen what I'd refused to see and had been kind enough or cowardly enough to let me find out on my own. The next morning, Daniel called me. I let it ring twice before answering, which was, for me, an act of tremendous willpower. His voice had that particular brightness people use when they're trying to control a conversation before it starts. He said he'd meant to talk to me before he made the change, that his financial advisor, a phrase that made my jaw tighten since I had been his financial advisor for most of his adult life, free of charge, had recommended he simplify his credit profile before applying for a mortgage. He said it wasn't personal. He said he'd still help me if I ever needed anything, just, informally, going forward. I asked him, calmly, whether he intended to pay back the $94,000 I had documented. There was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear his breathing change. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, that most of that had been gifts, that I'd never asked for it back before, so why was I bringing it up now like some kind of debt collector? I told him I had every transfer documented with dates and amounts, and that I wasn't calling myself a debt collector, I was calling myself his mother, who had just been publicly humiliated in a pharmacy checkout line by the son she'd quietly bankrolled for 3 years. He hung up, not dramatically, just a quiet click, the kind that somehow feels worse than shouting. I would love to tell you that I spent the following weeks in some triumphant blaze of strategic fury, but the truth is messier and more human than that. I cried more in that first week than I had during my entire divorce. I canceled a hair appointment because I didn't want anyone asking how I was doing. I reread old text messages from Daniel, the sweet ones from years ago, looking for the exact moment the sweetness had curdled into something transactional, and I never quite found it, because it hadn't been one moment. It had been a slow erosion, the kind you only recognize once you're standing on the edge of the cliff it created. What pulled me out of that week wasn't anger exactly. It was a phone call from an old colleague, Frank Delgado, who I'd worked alongside for 15 years before he'd left our company to start his own small accounting and consulting firm. He'd heard through a mutual friend that I was going through something difficult. Small towns and small professional circles talk even years later, and he called just to check on me, no agenda. When I told him what had happened, he went quiet in a way I recognized from years of watching him review other people's books. Then he said something that changed the shape of everything that followed. He said, "Carol, you didn't just lose access to some credit cards. You've been informally functioning as an unsecured lender to your own son for 3 years. And if what you're describing is accurate, some of that money was transferred specifically to cover obligations he misrepresented to you. Have you kept everything?" I told him I had, obsessively, almost embarrassingly so. He asked if he could look at it, purely as a friend, no charge, because he was curious and because, in his words, something about this doesn't smell like an accident. It took Frank 4 days to go through what I sent him. What he found rearranged my understanding of the previous 3 years entirely. The $11,000 bridge loan for the supposed work bonus had actually gone, in large part, toward a down payment on an engagement ring for Kayla, purchased 4 months before he ever mentioned her existence to me. The $8,000 business opportunity had never gone to any startup. It had paid off a personal loan Daniel had taken out to cover gambling losses from online sports betting, something Frank was able to trace because Daniel, not being especially careful, had used the same email address for both the loan application and a fantasy sports platform. And a little digging through public records and one very useful conversation with a former colleague who now worked in consumer lending showed the timeline lining up almost too neatly to be coincidence. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I did anything with it. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters both for the honesty of this story and for anyone listening who might be in a similar position. I never once considered doing anything illegal, anything cruel, anything that would humiliate Daniel the way he had humiliated me in that checkout line. What I wanted, more than revenge in the dramatic sense, was the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own head, documented, undeniable, so that I could stop doubting myself, stop wondering if I was the unreasonable one, stop lying awake rewriting conversations to make his behavior make sense. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't the confrontation Daniel expected, and I think that was the point. He'd been anticipating tears, or shouting, or the kind of guilt-laden phone call where I'd eventually apologize for bringing up money at all, because that's the pattern we'd fallen into over the years, me softening first, always. Instead, I invited him to lunch at a quiet diner near his office, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a waitress who calls everyone Han, and I brought a folder. Not dramatically. Just set it on the table between us like it was nothing more than a menu. He noticed it immediately, of course. He asked what it was with a laugh that didn't quite land. I told him it was a summary of the transfers I'd made to him over the last 3 years, along with some notes about where certain funds had actually gone, based on records that were, unfortunately for him, more public than he'd assumed. I watched the color drain out of his face in stages, first at the ring, then at the loan, then worst of all, at a line item where Frank had found a pattern of withdrawals that lined up almost perfectly with weekends. I now remembered him canceling plans with me, claiming to be sick. He didn't deny any of it, not really. He tried for about 90 seconds, the old tactics, the reframing, the "you're twisting this," the "you don't understand how hard things have been for me," and I let him talk, because I had learned by then that silence is often the most effective tool a person has, and interrupting him would have given him somewhere to hide. When he finally ran out of momentum, I told him calmly that I wasn't there to ruin his life. I told him I wasn't going to tell Kayla, wasn't going to call his employer, wasn't going to do any of the things that an angrier, less deliberate version of me might have fantasized about in the shower at 2 in the morning. What I told him instead was this: that I expected a real repayment plan, in writing, for a portion of what he owed me, not the full $94,000, because some of it truly had been given freely and I wasn't interested in punishing generosity retroactively, but for the roughly $41,000 that Frank and I had traced to expenses Daniel had specifically lied to me about, framed as emergencies that never existed. He asked quietly what would happen if he refused. I told him that I had already consulted an attorney, a family friend named Elaine Rourke, who specialized in financial disputes and who had confirmed that documented transfers made under demonstrably false pretenses could, in certain circumstances, support a civil claim, particularly given the paper trail Frank had assembled. I told him I sincerely hoped it would never come to that, because I did not want to sue my own son. The idea of it made me physically ill, but that I also was no longer willing to be someone whose kindness got quietly rewritten into an interest-free, guilt-free personal bank. What happened over the following months surprised me more than anything else in this whole ordeal. I expected Daniel to disappear, the way people sometimes do when they're caught, rather than confronted with love. Instead, something in him seemed to genuinely break open, not immediately, not gracefully, but eventually. He came to my apartment 3 weeks later, unannounced, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said he was sorry, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, it didn't sound like a performance designed to end an uncomfortable conversation. He told me about the gambling haltingly, the way people talk about things they've spent a long time trying not to name out loud, even to themselves. He told me Kayla had left him 2 weeks earlier, after finding out about some of what he'd hidden from her too, which explained a text I had privately received from her, out of nowhere, simply saying, "I think you should know some things about how he talks about you," followed by a screenshot that confirmed everything Frank's paperwork had already suggested. I didn't forgive him all at once, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this too often rush toward a tidy reconciliation that doesn't reflect how real relationships actually heal. We set up a repayment plan through Elaine, formalized, unsentimental, with actual monthly amounts and actual consequences if they lapsed, because I had learned, expensively, that love without structure is just an invitation for the people who take advantage of it. Daniel started seeing a counselor for the gambling, something he'd apparently known was a problem for over a year and had been too ashamed to admit even to himself. He got a second job on weekends, not glamorous work, just shifts at a hardware store, and every month, without fail, $400 appeared in my account, small compared to what he owed, but consistent in a way nothing about our financial relationship had ever been before. It took 14 months for the balance to clear. I remember the exact day it happened, because Daniel called me instead of just transferring the money silently the way he had the previous 13 times. And he said, "That's it, Mom. That's the last payment." There was a long pause on the line, and then he said something I've turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "I used to think you not having control over your own money made you weak. I think I just learned that the version of me who believed that was the weak one." I didn't say anything clever back. I just told him I was proud of him, and I meant it in a complicated, hard-won way that felt more honest than any of the easy affection we'd traded for years before. I won't pretend everything between us is perfect now, because it isn't, and I think pretending otherwise would cheapen what actually happened. We see each other every few weeks instead of every few days. I still keep my own detailed records of everything, a habit I don't think I'll ever fully unlearn, and honestly, I don't want to. What changed most wasn't Daniel, not really, not at first. What changed was me. I went back to Elaine and had her help me restructure my finances, entirely separate accounts, a small trust for my eventual retirement that no one but me can touch, credit cards in my own name that I rebuilt slowly, deliberately, without anyone's permission or generosity attached. I went back to work part-time as a financial consultant myself, helping a handful of small local businesses untangle exactly the kind of quiet mismanagement I'd spent my career noticing in other people's books. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was good at it, that the same instincts that had let me trace $94,000 through 3 years of careful denial were instincts other people were willing to pay for. Daniel and I had dinner 2 weeks ago, the kind of ordinary dinner we hadn't managed in years. No folder on the table, no tension underneath the small talk. Near the end of it, almost as an afterthought, he told me he'd started putting away a small amount every month into an actual retirement account of his own, the first time in his adult life he'd saved anything without an emergency attached to it. And he asked, half joking, half not, if I'd be willing to look it over sometime. Make sure he was doing it right. I told him I would. I meant it, and this time when I said yes to helping my son with his money, it didn't feel like the old reflex of a woman afraid to be anything other than endlessly giving. It felt like something closer to respect, offered freely, from someone who had finally learned the difference between love and being used, and who had, in the end, gotten to choose which one she was willing to give.